Good afternoon, everyone. This is a recording is conducted in Beijing. My name is Greta Yang. I am the director and organizer of Pearls of Wisdom Chinese Medicine. I am very, very pleased to be presenting for the first time Jason Barak, an international lecturer, and he's a translator and compiling the book of Bo-Wei, 56 Method Treatment Strategy. Bo-Wei is a very famous Chinese medicine practitioner, so please tune in and we hope to see you later.
Hey everyone. So just wanted to go through a couple special thanks to the people that made this possible. It's really difficult for me to manage a lot of this stuff, especially living in the United States and working with you guys over there. So Lionel's been great, taking care of everything and the technical aspects. He's a really great person to work with. And Greta Young I've been working with quite a bit recently on some projects, and so I thank her for her support. And then the Health World Limited is a really special sponsor to me because they actually brought me out to Australia last year around this time. And I had one of the best times of my life. It was a really great trip and got to meet a lot of great people there and did some lectures in a few cities. So it was really nice, so I really thank them again for supporting me doing this project. I'd like to give special thanks to Steve Saint and Trevor Moss at AcuNeeds, Chris and the team at Herb Booth for also helping us get the word out for this course. Thanks a lot, and I hope all you guys support those guys because without these people doing that, this wouldn't be possible. So I really appreciate all the herb companies and groups and people coming together to help me bring this to you guys. I wanted just to go through a little bit what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go through material that's related to my book, the Bo-Wei's 56 Treatment Methods, and we're going to talk about why these methods or principles, I'll use those words interchangeably, are important for me and important for practitioners like yourself, where the material kind of came from, some of the key players that made this possible, this perspective, or really pioneered it in a certain way that we'll talk about. And then the second half is going to be a really interesting look at Xiao Chai Hu Tang. This material isn't in my book, and I just found it really interesting because I've been reading a lot about it, on how you can view Xiao Chai Hu Tang in a way that gives it a lot more flexibility and expansion in the clinic, and the richness actually comes through understanding some of the nuanced bits of the treatment principles. So we're going to look at some of the richness around that, focusing a lot on the clinical aspect. In general, this material is very clinically based. So there may be some historical stuff here in the beginning, but as we get into the material, it should get more and more clinical. And what we'll be talking about in today's short intro is kind of an introduction to the overall course that I'll be teaching through Lionel and through Greta, through the Pearls. Basically, it's a 30-hour course, and it's more about teaching a thinking method based on these treatment principles and having a lot of case studies to look at, very clinically based, really trying to refine our thinking to think really precisely. We'll talk a lot about that today, and as well as some issues about Pao Zhi, like herbal processing. What do we do with this information? There's a lot of it in the book, and we see a lot in case studies. How do we manage this? And then finally, what do we do with classical formulas for today's time? How do we modify them? And when we look at Xiao Chai Hu Tang, we'll look at a lot of the issues around that. So I graduated with probably the same or similar education as pretty much all of you. I assume that most people in the West had a fairly standard TCM education. And I graduated and I started to wonder what the difference was between kind of what we're taught and the way that famous physicians and practitioners that I would read about in various case studies on how they practiced. It was clear that they had a very classical thought process, yet they had a very fluid and non-confining way of dealing with patients. And it was something that actually there was a bit of a disconnect for me on how we got to that, from that book knowledge to a lot of these case studies which looked nothing like what I learned in school. And it's not what I learned in school was incorrect or wrong, but it's just more about how do I take that next step into getting it to a really high-level clinical perspective on things. So this is something that really I started to question, and how I got to that point, and how would I get to a point of where these famous physicians were. So I started actually reading Bo-Wei years ago, and I think it might have been a recommendation of Chip Chase when I first moved to Boulder. I started working with him, and he actually translated a book on Bo-Wei, and he recommended reading some of it in Chinese. So I started reading it, and then I started to travel to China and study. And I met a lot of great doctors in China, and doors started to open up. I was exposed to a lot of new ideas. And it really was mind-blowing, some of the stuff that I started to encounter, because it clearly was different than what I was taught. And this is where things really got interesting to me. And I met Dr. Wu, or Dr. Wu Bo-Ping, on one of maybe my second trip to China, and we became really good friends. Actually, it was really interesting. One of the first questions he asked me is who I like to study, and I said I've been reading Bo-Wei a lot, and it was actually his teacher was Bo-Wei. And so we had an instant connection from the beginning. As you can see, Dr. Wu was born in 1935, so he's been alive for quite some time. He had about 50 years of clinical practice. He's retired now in Hangzhou. So as I mentioned, he was one of Bo-Wei's closest students, and he also studied with doctors like Zhao Bingnan and Ren Yingqiu, Ju Yan. These are really famous doctors that were in Beijing at the time of when he went to school. He was actually in the very first class, graduating class of the Beijing College of Chinese Medicine in 1962. Many of you may know Jason Robertson. He wrote a great acupuncture book, and his teacher, Wang Zhuyi, was actually in that same class. So these guys are some of the older practitioners that actually studied Chinese medicine in a different way than we do now. And even 1 year after they started studying, things changed. They were at the very first class, and they actually used classical text and memorized a lot of classical material as part of their training, and it dramatically changed after that. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looked like, because it does impact the way that we think about Chinese medicine, of course. And Wu Bo-Ping, he traveled the world. He was known as a teacher all around the world. He held key positions in Zhejiang, his hometown region, as well as Munich and London and Beijing and Seattle. He was at the Seattle Institute of Oriental Medicine. He really was quite a remarkable teacher and practitioner. Actually, when I first started watching him in the clinic, that's when I first started to see how amazing he was clinically. And he had some knack also for taking complex ideas in the clinic as well as theoretical and presenting them in a very simple, straightforward way. So this is one of the reasons he was such a good teacher. And he could really teach to whatever level people were at in front of him. It was a really amazing skill. One of the things that I asked Wu Bo-Ping when I was with him, probably one of the first or second times, I asked him if there was one book that we could translate into the West, what would that book be? And this is where the project that I have done with the Bo-Wei's 56 Methods came from. We were sitting in his house. He actually reached behind a bookcase that he had. It was very peculiar, and he pulled out a book that was wrapped in this cloth, and the book was pretty much falling apart, and it was a handwritten book, actually. And a lot of the texts back then in the 50s and 40s were handwritten just because of they weren't printing a lot of text at the time, and this is just how they perpetuated their books and information. And he pulled up this book and said, "This is the book that I think that you should translate." And it was this Bo-Wei's 56 Methods. And basically what this is, it's a synthesis of ideas throughout history. Bo-Wei gathered a lot of the historical formulas and extracted the ideas from those formulas and then created treatment methods. And I wondered at first why Dr. Wu thought this was important. Actually, it was a very skinny book. I think in Chinese maybe 10 or 20 pages. It was very terse. And I started to see that it was really a missing link in our educational process. We, of course, all learn about treatment methods, and we'll talk exactly what those are in a little bit. But they're really underemphasized. And we can, because of this, because we have some understanding already, we can easily integrate this material into what we already know, but it does fill somewhat of a void. I personally it has transformed my practice as I start to think through the clinic and through my patients and the formulas that I give them using these treatment methods. So we'll talk a lot about this book as we go today. But one of the things that the actual book that I worked on with Wu Bo-Ping that makes it really interesting is that Dr. Wu provided commentary on Qin's original material. So he studied with Qin for about 15 years and then used those ideas in Qin's original book for about 50 years in the clinic, and then he kind of passed that on to me, for lack of a better word, and we came up with this book. So it turned out to be about 400 pages, and so maybe 30, 40, 20 pages of the original text are from Qin. And so it turned into a very clinical-based manual. And it's something very important that we don't see often in China, because China's books are often very terse. They just give you a line or 2 lines, a formula, and then they want you to figure it out. Dr. Wu was really kind of answering a lot of my questions and explaining things very detailed, in a very detailed manner so that we could understand them in the West and don't have to sit there and process it for years of time, which sometimes is worthwhile, of course, because it helps us really solidify ideas. But nonetheless, he really brought the book to life and cut out a lot of the hard work, per se, of going through a simple book like this. So I like to just put up this case study at the beginning of these lectures just for fun, because this is a case study that I saw in Wu Bo-Ping's clinic in 2007. So this was, I don't know, one of the earlier times that maybe third or fourth time that I went and studied with Dr. Wu. And you can kind of just read through this yourself. And I want you to think about what you would do if you saw this patient in your clinic. So there was episodes of weakness. He was inability to stand for short periods of time. He was unable to climb some mountains in Tibet, which he was there recently, at that time, of course. He didn't have any dizziness or tinnitus, and X-rays of the joints and legs were negative. He had frequent urination and severe night sweats. And the weakness, which made the weakness worse. So when he urinated and when he sweat, then his weakness would get worse. And the sweat had an odor to it. His bowels also had an odor, and he had some abdominal distension. And on palpation in the stomach, this area, REN 12 and REN 8, I don't know if you can see that on me, but anyway, you know where it is, was tender. He didn't drink alcohol and didn't eat spicy food. He had a dark, greasy yellow tongue coat and soggy pulse. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but what you can do on your own is look at these herbs and look at the case study later and think about why he picked these herbs. For fun, I put the categories on the right. The categories are often misleading for herbs, so I think it's the first thing we often think about, like, oh, this is a drain damper, clear damp heat. Sometimes that's useful, but a lot of times it can lead us astray. For example, Binglang for expel parasites, that doesn't really make much sense in this kind of case. So there's a broader picture that we want to grasp in a case like this. The reason I find this interesting because I would have never come up with this type of strategy for this patient. I might have wanted to clear damp heat, but this strategy in particular is very unique to Wu Bo-Ping and his lineage. So it might be nice just to go through and think about why these herbs are there and think about which 3 formulas these herbs make up and what treatment principle, main treatment principle and secondary treatment principles are being used here. As we go into the course, I think in class number 3, we'll actually see this case again and break it down line by line. And by then, I'm certain you'll know exactly why every herb is in here, and it'll make much more sense. This is one of his more complicated cases, I think, but nonetheless, it's interesting. And one thing we can see right away is the extensive use of Paozhi, the chows, the jiao, and the tan, da huang tan. These really are important for the practice for Dr. Wu. So the basic lineage that Dr. Wu comes from, as I mentioned, his main teacher was Bo-Wei. And Bo-Wei's main teacher was Ding Ganren. Ding Ganren had one of the most famous schools in the early 1900s. He was also one of the most famous doctors around of his time. And Bo-Wei actually was one of Ding Ganren's top 3 students, and they called him the Ding 3. All of these doctors actually were in the Meng He lineage, and Volker Scheid has a great book on Meng He, and that's worth checking out if you're interested in this lineage. But one of the things that you want to know about this lineage, which makes it very important, I think, for us today, is that they used very small formulas in general, a light-natured formula. They used smaller doses, and they kind of emulated a style based on Ye Tianshi and those like southern doctors. So Bo-Wei and Wu Bo-Ping both were exceptional practitioners that focused on very complicated diseases. For example, Wu Bo-Ping treated a lot of autoimmune and dermatology. And they really were known as clinicians, and they just happened to also be great teachers. It's really a rare mix, I find. And one interesting thing I like to just talk about for Bo-Wei and Ding Ganren, both of them were not just about the medicine. They really believed in a broad-based education and life experience. And they thought that was important for developing a high-level clinical practice. So they often memorized philosophical texts, and Qin was actually also an accomplished calligrapher and poet and artist. And he actually published quite a bit of poetry throughout his life. This right here on this slide is some of his art and poetry, actually. So a little bit about Bo-Wei is that he was born in the Shanghai region in 1901. As I mentioned, he went to Ding Ganren's college from 1919 to 1923. And he also studied with Cao Yingfu, and Cao Yingfu was a very famous Jingfang doctor. And I mention this because we want to remember that and Jingfang being Shanghan Lan and Jingwei Yaowei. But we want to know that Bo-Wei had this really strong classical background before he went and developed this system. He was really solid in his classical medicine. He actually memorized the Neijing, and it was nicknamed Qin Neijing. This guy really understood a lot about this era of medicine. And so he really thought that the foundation of Chinese medicine should be the classics, and he thought that it should firmly be based in ancient wisdom. But one of the things that he often said, and I think is important to realize also, is he warned us against paying excessive attention to the exact wording of those texts. So although he saw the value, he definitely was not pedantic about what the words in the text. And we'll see that over and over again as he expands some of that classical idea into modern day. So he was very open, and he didn't believe in any single methodology or school of thought. He really just sought after the most effective and practical methods. Actually, he was a big proponent of integrating warm disease and Shanghan Lun and cold damage, and he wrote a lot about this actually. And it wasn't until probably the 1800s where there was a divide between the warm disease and Shanghan. But Bo-Wei was really a big advocate of putting these two back together and creating one system that used the treatment principles based on both of them. He basically said, you know, this is just the body we have, and these separate theories are not actually separate. They're looking at the same body, so why do we have to keep them separated? I think it's something really important to contemplate, even in today's time, where we see this divide between, oh, I'm a, Shanghan practitioner or something like this, and never really made much sense to me why we would, pigeonhole ourselves like that. But nonetheless, I think that that's a whole other conversation. And he wasn't against Western medicine. He believed in aspects of Western medicine, but the most important thing is he thought that Chinese medicine should be the umbrella for Western medicine, not the other way around, and that Chinese medicine had its distinctly own scientific spirit. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later, and that's very important historically. Bo-Wei ended up treating all sorts of high-level officials in Soviet Union and Mongolia. Since he was one of the top doctors of the time, they sent him to different countries. This is why we know he was actually, very well regarded. So he did a lot. He was a teacher. He wrote over 50 books. He taught about 5,000 students. He synthesized and collected doctrines from the past, and he took complex ideas and contradictions in the classical texts, and there's a lot of them. And he said, well, how do we make sense of that? How do we wrestle with this and come up with something that works in the clinic? He always brought it back to the clinic, and that's exactly where the treatment principles come into play. Because of all this, in the 1950s, the Ministry of Health brought him to Beijing to work for them, and essentially he became kind of the grandfather of TCM. We'll talk more about that because actually a lot of his core ideas were not put into TCM, but he was one of the original people to work on synthesizing it in the beginning. His synthesis in his book that is related to my book is called New Guidelines for Treatment. And this calligraphy underneath here, this is Youbo Fan Yue, and this was given to Wu Bo-ping by Bo-Wei, and Wu actually gave this kind of calligraphy to me, and I hang it in my office now. And what it says is, from the plentiful, return to the simple. This kind of sums up this lineage of thought, I think, meaning the scholar starts with an extensive amount of knowledge and then ultimately strives for a profound yet concise understanding. And this is what he did with the New Guidelines in Treatment. Basically, how do master physicians take a complex case, and we all have these complex cases, and come up with a simple answer? That was kind of his mission and his clinical prowess. And this was written in 1953. This actually predates almost all of Mao Zedong's influence. It took him about 20 years actually to come up with all of this material, and we'll talk more about that. The book itself is organized into 13 chapters, and you'll see really quickly how this differs from many of the texts that we have now. So the chapters are phlegm, cold, qi, blood, deficiency, fire, dryness. A lot of our chapters now, if you look at most clinical books, are organized by disease. This is a dramatic difference, just to keep in mind as we talk more about this material. And let's say we look at the phlegm chapter. The phlegm chapter would start off with a bunch of information about phlegm, talking about the pathodynamics and how it comes about and all of this, and then it has 8 treatment principles, and these are the principles we're talking about. Each principle has a formula and also has some information to help you diagnose that or help you use that exact treatment principle. In 1961, actually, it started in 1958, I think. I think the 61 is maybe an official publication, but in 58, Chin put out a second system that's worth noting. This is called the 14 Essential Guiding Principles. His original system that I find most interesting, that we'll be talking most about, has formulas based from his lineage and based from his clinical practice. And that's why they're so interesting. But the 14 Essentials takes the same type of organization, wind, cold, damp, and dryness, and kind of updates it and makes it a little bit more politically correct. You have to realize what's happening at this time in history is that a lot of doctors and committees are trying to come up with systems of synthesis to create this TCM or to create something under Mao Zedong. Bo-Wei wanted to create something, but his original system wasn't very successful because it was very lineage based. So he took the basic idea and then he kind of changed it in a way that I think is not very interesting. But what he does do that's still worth mentioning, and we'll go back to it here and there during our course, is that he takes the 6 pathogens, 8 principles, chi, blood, fluids, 3 burners, 4 divisions, 4 levels, 6 divisions, all of this stuff, and he puts it all together. This is the synthesis that I find useful. This type of thinking. This is just a further breakdown of what that 14 Essentials looks like. Within the text itself, we have, for example, wind, and then we have wind damage, wind strike, internal wind, and then they talk about some simultaneous patterns under cold, cold damage, cold strike, deficiency, cold. And then under the cold chapter itself, then he gets into the treatment principles there. Acrid, warm, promote sweating, and then he gives you Ma Huang Tang. Generate fluids, resolve muscle air, then he gives you Gogen Tang. So he's using standard formulas to kind of appease the masses and appease the government agencies. Also, of course, he gives you core diagnostic symptoms and how to differentiate from other patterns. And then he gives something really cool that he does in a lot of his books, as well as the 14 Essentials, is that he starts to create these lists of herbs based on treatment principles. So if you want to scatter cold, first you have to understand what scatter cold means. Is that different than expel cold? It is. And so he starts to give you these lists. And we all have seen these terms used throughout all our materia medicas, but a lot of times we don't pay really specific attention to it. His language is very precise, and he starts to kind of nitpick what these words actually mean. For example, we have expel cold and return yang. How is that different than support yang? There is a difference, and he starts to tease those out. So you have these lists, and then when you have a patient in front of you and you need a certain kind of principle, you have core principle formulas that he gives us, as well as these lists, and it helps you just organize the material in another layer of another level. But I want to go back a little bit to kind of the origins of TCM. So I don't think I'm going to tell you guys anything you haven't heard before about the origins of TCM. We all know that there was something happening with Mao Zedong's influence, and what that is debatable. I think there's a lot of different ideas on how he might have changed in the medicine. But I want to talk about a little bit of how Bo-Wei, about his involvement in that process, and just the basic outline of what was happening in the 50s. So the main focus of TCM's influence from Mao in the 50s was he wanted to create a system that was under the umbrella of Western medicine. I think most of us know this. It later became a separate type of medicine, Chinese medicine, Western medicine, but for quite a while, for a few years, they were going to be integrated, and Chinese medicine was essentially going to be kind of weeded out, or just soaked up into the umbrella. This was very complicated for Chinese medicine because a lot of simplifications had to happen. With any synthesis, of course, there's going to be some type of simplification, but these simplifications were very drastic, actually. One of the main thrusts of this synthesis that was happening from Mao was that he wanted to teach Western medicine doctors Chinese medicine. So he needed a system that was actually very pared down, that he could teach these Western doctors and then they could practice both. This was his original vision. This is very important because the TCM, it's called the Outlines of Chinese Medicine, that came out of Nanjing in 1958, competed kind of directly with Qin's system and won. And this is the system that actually a lot of our books from that era, from the earlier years, were taken from. So, for example, The Web That Has No Weaver, Maschiosis Fundamentals, CAM, these core textbooks were from this very simplified system. So something definitely happened then that actually Bo-Wei was not happy with. Although Qin was a part of this foundation of synthesis, when it started to get too far, he and about four other physicians in the Ministry of Health wrote a letter to the government protesting what they were doing, and said that we need to get back to the roots of Chinese medicine, have classical study, as well as classical methods of teaching. And so this was a really big deal when the Cultural Revolution hit, because, as many of you know, if you speak out against the government during that time, then you were persecuted. And so he was demoted from all his positions of being a physician and working in the Ministry of Health, and he was actually made to clean toilets. And this probably led to his early death, this emotional blow. So in the end, a lot of his core ideas that he believed in actually was not integrated into TCM, and we find a lot of those in the 56 methods. Actually, the 56 methods was somewhat destroyed in the Cultural Revolution. That original text that I talked to you about, that I told you about from Dr. Wu, is actually one of the first written down and represents something that very unique, because his students got a hold of those texts over the years and actually started to change them, actually change the text. And as Qin went into the 14 Essentials, some of those ideas came in to the 56 methods. So it became very convoluted. So that first system that from 1953 is actually fairly pure from influence, and that's why I think is really interesting, and it has that 20 years that he worked on it beforehand, before Mao got a hold of Chinese medicine. Just to mention, there was a lot of different systems at that time also. I think I mentioned this earlier. So I have Paul Unshold up here, and he, as many of you know, is a historian of Chinese medicine. He's fairly controversial because he doesn't really, I guess a lot of people say he doesn't really believe in Chinese medicine per se. I mean, I'm not really sure about the details, but he said something very interesting that I recently read. He talks about TCM being an artificial system of health, which was generated by committees in 1950 to 1975. So it's always nice to hear a really hardcore historian validate what we already kind of know. And the aim of restructuring this vast heritage of Chinese medicine in a way that fitted the political situation of the time, as well as fitting in with modern science. This is what TCM is built on. And it's understandable that they did this. But one of the things that Paul points out is we in the West don't necessarily have to go along with it. We might not make these same choices. They have their political reasons for trying to manipulate Chinese medicine in a way that we don't actually have to go by. So I have some problems actually with the way that Chinese medicine is practiced in China by the majority of people. So I think there's good and bad to all of this, all of these different systems, but I think we just want to understand the history of where this stuff comes from before we make our decisions. And it's not a new, it's not an old thing that's happening with Chinese medicine. It's very new also. And Paul points out, just in 2007, China had a conference with over 50 countries coming in, a medicine conference. And basically they said that TCM is part of modern biomedicine, and the basis of TCM is molecular biology. If you agree or disagree, I guess it doesn't really matter. But I think it just shows you the direction of Chinese medicine at this point. And if we're looking for kind of a more authentic style, we may have to go back in time a little bit. At least that's what I have found. Because the progression right now is much more modernized, for better or worse. And Ted Kapchuk says something very clear that I think we need to keep in mind, that TCM basically is only one of many conceivable options that lie within the medical perspective of Oriental medicine. So there's lots of different ways that we can practice, and we're going to be looking at one of those. So in summary, I want to look at basically TCM and Chin's system, and basically his guidelines, his 56 methods. So outlines, this is the one that was used for TCM and created the web and all these other books. It was from Nanjing, which is a very powerful city at the time, and Chin was from Shanghai. Outlines was made by a committee. Chin kind of did it on his own with his lineage. That's one of the reasons it wasn't accepted. Outlines used standard classical formulas, and Chin used his lineage's formulas and ideas. And then, as mentioned, when he did his next system, he also used classical formulas to try to fit in with the mainstream. Outlines was simplified for MDs. Guidelines was a traditional model, which was much more complex for MDs to follow. Nothing against MDs, but if you haven't trained solidly in Chinese medicine, it is a little trickier. But it's also easier to research, and this is a very strong point. And the guidelines was quite difficult to research, and the reason being is guidelines focuses on individual treatments, outlines focuses more on diseases and patterns. And then outlines kept, in our TCM model, actually keeps the separate schools of thought, keeps the schools of thought separate. So for example, we have the Wenbing school, we have the cold damage school. It likes to separate those out. And this actually appeals to a lot of doctors of the time, because a lot of doctors like to be associated with their school. They're like, hey, I'm a Shanghan doctor. I'm very proud of this. I'm a Wenbing doctor. And Chin just got rid of that, as we've talked about. So TCM has this basic flow chart model. I think everyone's familiar with this. This is the way I was taught when I was in school. Basically, you have a patient come in, and they have some disease or chief complaint, and then you figure out what pattern that is. And then you basically just come up with a formula. So I think we all learn about these treatment principles in this progression: disease, pattern, treatment method, formula, but we often go from pattern to formula and kind of just bypassing this treatment method. Let's take an example of dampness in the middle. This is what we would call a pattern, right? So how is that different than the treatment principle? Treatment principle is what you do with that pattern. Is that correct? Chin's 56 methods starts with the pathology, as we talked about, maybe starts with phlegm, and then goes straight into the treatment method, considering the disease and considering the pattern, and then to the formula. So he puts it all together, but disease and pattern is not as important. I mean, we still have to think about it, but in the progression of things, it's kind of secondary. Actually, in his book, 56 methods, he never mentions any biomedical disease, and really keeps things in the manner we're talking about: pathology, treatment method, formula. And patterns are put in as some commentary so we can make sense of it. So if we look at dampness in the middle again, how do we treat that? Well, we can, of course, just give something like Ping-Wei-san, right? And that's just going straight to the formula. So, for example, someone comes in, they have, nausea, vomiting, and then you say, oh, dampness in the middle, and then, Ping-Wei-san or whatever. But there's actually quite a few treatment principles that you can use for dampness in the middle. You may just start with aromatically transformed damp. Or you may need to use bitter, warm, and dry damp turbidity. Or you might have to use blandly leach out and eliminate dampness. All of these are very specific methods that have herbs associated with them and formulas from Chin's book. So the basic structure, to summarize, is 13 chapters based on pathology. And then we have the treatment methods for each pathology. Each treatment method has a presentation of how you diagnose it. And then you have this 7-ingredient formula. And this is very important because the 7 ingredients is a very small number in very small doses. And it's a very compact, tight formula that represents that treatment method that can be inserted into a multiple treatment protocol or even given on its own to a patient. And then, as I mentioned, Wu Ping provides commentary for the book. So Chin's formulas are updates on classical formulas. So, for example, he has a chapter on harmonized yin and wei. We all know that Guizhi is indicated for this. But he updates it for modern day and adds different herbs, takes away things, and he creates a formula that's better suited for us. Smaller doses, very precise, and small amount of ingredients. So the 56 method summary is a true synthesis. It's not just a bunch of formulas with patterns. I think most of our books say you have this pattern, here's a formula, and there's just thousands of these formulas out there, and books that have thousands of formulas in them. But this is really focusing on a thought process, a traditional thought process, teach you how to think, and it's based in the Menghe lineage. It really focuses on clear diagnosis and very compact formulas, and part of that is using herbal preparations as well as creating building blocks for custom formulas. So why do we have building blocks? What is building blocks? We often hear this term juxtaposed between like a Shanghan or Jingfeng practitioner, which sees a Xiao Chai Hu Tong patient and gives them Xiao Chai Hu Tong, and kind of juxtaposed with modern day practitioners or maybe Qing Dynasty, which write building block type of formulas where they take a little bit for this, give a little bit for that, give a little bit for that. But actually, as we'll see, Zhong Jing, that's actually how he intended to practice, or had intended for people to practice, was this building block method. And we're going to see clear examples of that with Xiao Chai Hu Tong. So it's very useful when people come in with multiple diseases, or when people are in between patterns, they have a laundry list of symptoms. What do you do with that? Of course, you can just give one formula and hope for the best, or you can customize it and make a precise prescription, and that's what we're talking about.